And good afternoon, folks. Welcome to AtlanTec 2022. It's great to be back again for another year. As you will have seen, there's a whole program of events throughout the course of the coming few days. Today, we're joined by my colleague, Brian Jordan from Cisco. For some background on Brian, maybe you'll recognize Brian's name. Brian presented with Cisco at AtlanTec a number of years ago when we were in person in UAG a couple of years back. Brian is head of innovation and industry solutions in Cisco and leads up our Irish Country Digital Acceleration Program. Over 35 years experience working with multiple multinationals, including Sun Systems, Dell, and now Cisco. His role is focused on customers on their digitalization journey, leveraging emerging and disruptive technologies such as IoT, blockchain, and AI. And as part of the Cisco Ireland management team, he's also a board member of our Public Services Innovation Advisory Board and technical vice chair of the Irish Digital Health Leadership Steering Group. So in a moment, I'll hand over to Brian, but just to remind everyone, the AtlanTec program continues throughout the course of the week. Do visit atlantec.ie and sign up and subscribe to the coming sessions. We have a large range of speakers again coming throughout the next couple of days. So a great lineup of talks and insights from thought leaders in the respective fields. Without further ado, it's my pleasure again to welcome Brian to the AtlanTec stage.
Thank you, Patrick, and welcome to everybody. I do hope you enjoyed the session. So I'm going to talk about digital transformation in action, our country digital acceleration program. Jay, if you could please advance the slide. Okay. So throughout this session, I'm going to give you a little bit of the background on the program, but I think what will be a hell of a lot more interesting will be some actual digital transformation projects that I'm happy to present to you. But first of all, let's start here, because I'd like everybody to think, you know, what kind of innovations have you seen over, say, the last? So go back to 2010, we're in 2020, and try and think, what were the innovations that year? And if I look back at that period of time, it was the introduction of the tablet computer was probably the major innovation. And we're now in 2022. If you go forward to 2030, what kind of innovations do you expect you're going to see? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a challenge here. Please go to the next slide. Let's say I was to offer all of you, and this is not a formal offer, but let's say I was to put $500,000 on the table to you. And my challenge to you is come up with a technical innovation that would improve society or maybe improve industry. But think of a technical would be very, very transformational. If you just build out the slide, Jay, please. I don't have access. And I wonder how you'd actually approach this problem. Right, you might look at all of the different bleeding edge technologies and see how you can actually apply them to a particular project that might have a big impact. Build out the rest of the slide, please, and the next one. You may look at some of the problems across the planet. There might be, you know, how do we make citizens' life a lot easier? And I love these two diagrams because they're quite informational. If you look at the one of the planet there, like most people are living within that little circle on the right-hand side. Or maybe you might look at projects that are more industrial use case based. And I do like the diagram on the right-hand side. You can see different countries, what they're best known for. And this is really what our country digital acceleration program is all about, is looking at funding projects across the world that can have a huge transformational impact on either industry or maybe a citizen, something that's in the country's national interest. Can I have the next slide, please? So my background and my job, I work in the CTO office. I do lead up the CDA program for Cisco Ireland. And when we look at the kind of projects we get involved in, modernizing national infrastructure is a key target area. And what we mean by that is we look at transportation services, we look at health services, policing, even down to local services, anything that might have a number of characteristics. We're interested in those kind of projects. And those characteristics are they transformational? So what's the idea? Are they replicable and scalable? In other words, if we invest in a project through this particular program, is it something that can actually scale out? And I'm going to give you a number of examples in a few minutes. We're also interested in accelerating digital skills, or anything that might help create new jobs or digitize public services. And next slide, please. And please go on to the next slide. That slide shouldn't be in there. Against that backdrop, we have a number of focus areas, and it's interesting to see over the next 10 years how information technology is going to impact what we are doing. We definitely are in an era, I guess, of trying to solve the climate challenge. And hence, we are looking at a lot of projects in the kind of renewable space, whether that's in wind power, electric power, the circular economy. And if you look at the bottom there, there's one of the more interesting themes. Some of the new circular economy legislation that's coming out now, we're going to have a thing called digital product passports. And what that is on higher value products, there is going to be a label that actually tells you what that product is made from, how to actually recycle that product, and we'll actually be tracing a product right from its source right to the end user. So think of this as, if we're going to enter into what's known as a circular economy, everything we make, we need to reuse. And to reuse, we need to know where that product has gone and what it's made from and how we'll actually get it recycled and give it an actual second life. The next slide, please. Here's one of the interesting things we've noticed over the last number of years. Normally, when we look at ICT spend or the spend in the kind of digital sector, it very much tracks a percentage level that equates with kind of national GDP output. And we've actually seen an acceleration of increased spend, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So over the last couple of years, there has been more being spent on digitization of services. And I think this is a natural disconnect now that we've got. As we've moved into this hybrid world, we see a lot more technology, I guess, being applied to solve the problem of everybody needing to work from home, all the cybersecurity requirements we have as a consequence of that. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do is start focusing on some of the areas to give you an idea before I go into actual examples. And I'll give a couple of Irish examples and a couple of international examples. But what kind of projects are we looking for when we talk about a country's digital infrastructure? Very often we'll focus on utility networks. So a very good example might be the National Water Network, which is very, in relative terms, very old, is not very automated. So I think we've all experienced things in terms of water leaks. So a little fact of interest, we actually lose 50% of the manufactured clean water in Ireland at present. And that's down to a lack of an ability to be able to detect leaks and actually detect potential leaks before they actually happen. And all of those kind of problems or challenge areas are easily solved with the application of IoT type technologies. We look very closely at ports, and I will give you an actual example coming up in a few minutes. We'll look at transportation, and especially now in the transportation sector, when everything's going electric, we are going to live in a world of batteries as we move forward. You will have batteries obviously in cars, but we'll have them in houses, in trailers. Nearly everything we do as we move forward, we'll have a battery associated with it. And that's a natural consequence of kind of green energy, which is an unstable kind of supply when we look at solar and wind. So we do need kind of battery technology integrated everywhere. We will look very closely at smart cities and smart towns, whether that's smart parking, smart lighting, anything to do, or even connectivity in cities and towns. Next slide, please. Okay, so if I was to put these down into 5 or 6 categories, education, smart communities, health, I'm going to pick one from the health sector. I'm going to pick one from the transportation sector. But let's get into it, and I'll give you some stories of actual products or projects that we've been investing in. Next slide, please. So Clare Island. So this is an example of a project that we've just initiated and signed contracts for. We're working with NUIG and the Health Service Executive. So Clare Island is a little island, as you can see, off the west coast of Ireland. Next slide, please. There's not a lot of people living on the island. There's about 160 people of all ages, some of them elderly. You can see the main kind of industries there: farming, fishing, tourism, crafts. It does require a little ferry to get access to the island. Next slide, please. So here's the challenge that we actually had. And I had the pleasure of going out to this island and physically looking at the kind of conditions the inhabitants all live in. There is no resident doctor and there is no pharmacy, right? There is a public health nurse. So think about this for a minute. If you have some kind of acute condition, medical condition, heart condition, kidney, liver, or even if you have an accident, if you don't have a resident doctor, it means you have to get off the island and go to the mainland to actually get some health service. Next slide, please. This is the actual ferry, and I had the pleasure of going on this particular boat not so long ago. But the first point I'd like to make is it's got no wheelchair access. So think about that for a minute as you try and take a patient down off the pier into the boat, where you're going to have to physically lift the patient. Build out the slide, please. So when we get to kind of winter conditions, we have a completely different scenario. There are many, many occasions when it's actually impossible to actually leave the island on that ferry. And if you just click again, Jay, please. Which means we actually have to bring in a helicopter to get the patient off the island. Next slide, please. So what are we looking at out there? Does technology actually have a role? Could we make this a little bit easier for the inhabitants of the island? One of the strategies of the HSE is a strategy called Stay Left, Shift Left. And what that means is we need to get all of the services as close to the patient in the home as possible. So technology can actually have a huge role to play here. If you think of the amount of sensors we have now for measuring oxygen levels or doing insulin type tests, even heart monitors, like all of those, if they're connected up to the patient, can actually give us a huge amount of data about the condition of that patient and whether there's any deterioration of that patient. And that allows us then to actually, I guess, go into a preventative mode of getting a doctor out to the island prior to an actual incident happening. So what we're building, we actually have a couple of challenges out in the island. One is a digital divide challenge. And that's where the connectivity of the existing signals for any kind of internet access is quite lacking on the island. And two, obviously, from a health service to the mainland. But also think about if you were diabetic on that island and the weather was bad and you have actually run out of insulin, what would you do? How do you actually solve that? So an additional part of this project we're looking at is actually drone deliveries. So we'll have all the preventative kind of infrastructure in place so that we can try and prevent anybody going to the hospital as far as possible, but also then for delivery of any kind of pharmaceutical solutions that are needed, we can do that by drone delivery. Next slide, please. So when I look at the transportation sector, there's a lot of efficiencies that can be brought into transportation. So we have projects right around the world looking at traffic management, but also looking at civilian safety on these, whether it's train, whether it's on the road. We can actually optimize a lot of the routing and the traffic management if we actually sensorize all of these solutions. So you take projects like we have out in Adelaide, in New South Wales, or in Las Vegas, where we're looking at putting sensors on the side of roads and cameras. And from that, we can detect everything. We can either do visual analytics on the amount of traffic that's coming, on what the pedestrians are doing, what way are they walking, are they jaywalking across intersections. You can increase the kind of flow rate, and you can change traffic lights. So a lot of transportation kind of things can be made a lot more efficient. If you look at trains, some of the projects we've been doing is enabling very fast Wi-Fi access on the trains. So one of the most irritating things is to be on a train and trying to work as you go through different mobile areas and losing signal, and your video might drop or your audio might drop. We've been putting very fast access points on the track side, so you have a very consistent user experience as you complete your journey. Next slide, please. One of my favorite projects is out in the port of Rotterdam. And this is a project we actually did with IBM. And Rotterdam is possibly one of the busiest ports in the world. I think it does about 170,000 ships in a year. So that's quite a lot of ships that you're looking at getting in and out of the port. Now, if you take the fact that it can take hours to get a ship into the port, get all of the cargo off the ship, and again get the ship back out to sea. In typical terms, it's about $80,000 per hour, right? So if you can make that process more efficient, then obviously you're going to save a lot of money. So what the port's vision was that we're heading into a world of autonomous ships. And to have autonomous ships actually dock, you need a lot of connectivity. So sensors have been put in to detect the weather, the wind, the tide, the flow rate, the salinity of the water, which, believe it or not, has an impact of when ships can actually come into port. So when you take all of that data and you build a digital twin of the port, you can now alert the ships as to when and how to actually approach their berthing areas in a much more efficient manner. So this has been a tremendously successful project. It's something we're looking at with and in discussions in some of the ports in Ireland. Next slide, please. Even down to the patrol vessels, they can be very much operated remotely. So if you think of the amount of sensors, like positioning sensors we might have on a patrol vessel, but also the sea conditions, all of that can be communicated back into a central kind of operation, and you can make much more intelligent decisions on the operation of these vessels. Next slide, please. Here we have smart dolphins, and what you're seeing here is just they're solar powered, as you can see, so quite a green solution. But they're also censored to pick up the kind of depth of the water, the salinity, and surrounding kind of weather conditions. And next slide, please. And you can see the same kind of solutions then go into kind of bollards. You can look at when a ship is actually in berth, what kind of the traffic rates are. So all of this data. So typical digital twinning approach to making the assets more efficiency. And even when we leave, and I don't have it on the slides, it's not just about the ships coming into port. We call that the kind of marine operations side of a port. But if you look at the land operations, how quickly can you get the cargo off a ship, right? Where is all the cargo that you want to load on a ship? So all of these things can be track and trace. You'd be surprised at the amount of inefficiency there can be when you're looking for a particular trailer load and wondering where is it in the port, because that needs to get loaded in a particular order. So these are all efficiency challenges, right down to the smart parking you might have in the port. But if you extend that even out to how do we get traffic out of a port and onto our major highways? So in Holland, they actually have linked up the kind of port operations with the traffic management on the major routes, so they can route traffic more effectively in and out of the port. So on to the next example here. And I did indicate that we're going to live in a world of batteries, and it's quite fascinating what they're doing in London. And this is a project called eFlex. Now, if anybody has an electric car, you'll know that charging them is a common experience. But in major cities, when we charge up all of these cars, we get an awful lot of electricity that's stored. Now, think of the concept in reverse. What all the power providers are having to do at the moment is, if we went 100% renewable energy and the wind is not blowing and it's nighttime, so you're not really generating any energy, you actually have to take power back from some kind of electricity storage, typically batteries. And there's a lot of technologies being developed now for how these things are going to get stored. But think of fleets of cars when they're not being used and when the grid is under pressure. If we had a mechanism for getting the power back out of the batteries in all these cars and supplying it back to the grid, that becomes very interesting, because you take the utilities are very interested in paying for that service so that you can get a consistent supply back into the grid. So eFlex is all about vehicle to grid kind of energy trading. So if you have a power in your battery, you could actually get paid for that power if you don't need all of that excess energy. So quite an interesting project. Next slide, please. One of my favorite project is actually come out of Germany. This is a Medibus. And if you think of the story I was giving you a few minutes ago about Clare Island, delivering health services to people in remote areas, it can be quite challenging. So why not bring the service as much as possible right out to the citizen, rather than having the citizen to come into some kind of care center? So they took a bus and used CDA to fund it. They changed it into a medical center. So there's effectively labs built into the bus and waiting rooms and video conferencing capability. And of course, it's all 5G enabled. And this has been a huge success over in Germany. It's something I'd love to introduce in Ireland as well. But when COVID came along, it actually became a mobile vaccination center. So it got kind of a dual use. I've been reviewing another project also out. I think it's in the Middle East somewhere. I think possibly Israel, where we've been looking at a 5G ambulance has been constructed, and you think, well, you know, what's that going to do? Well, if you think that if you have a patient in an ambulance, the data on the condition of that patient, if you can transmit that in real time, you know, anything from their oxygen levels to their heart rate to their actual condition, any kind of measure you might take as the ambulance is heading towards the hospital might be the difference between life and death for that patient. Because normally what's happening is the ambulance personnel are actually giving an update on the patient as they arrive at the hospital, which isn't as quite as efficient as kind of sending that data in real time to the hospital. Next slide, please. So this is where, if I look forward on the program, you know, what we're looking for projects in lots of interesting areas. So you can see anything to do with cybersecurity. We have done a lot of projects worldwide in kind of cyber protection, certainly for national critical infrastructure. But if we look at other areas like Wi-Fi 6 or 5G, even quantum computing, these are all interesting technologies that can help a digital transformation. We're very interested in sustainability type projects. So whether that's kind of smart buildings, it might be smarter manufacturing with Industry 4.0 type solutions, right into all the things, you know, across industry, health, education, or anything that might help regions. Are all potentially interesting projects. But I'm going to give you a few characteristics for all the projects that we've been involved in. The idea is not the only thing of interest here, right? There are many, many smart ideas. And the money and the funding is not the only thing that is critical to success. We look for projects with companies where there's a culture of innovation, because that's a really important characteristic for success, but also wide stakeholder buy-in, right? We've really looked at, if we're going to engage on a CDA project, that there's buy-in right across the business, because very often these projects don't gain the traction they should if it's only one small section in an organization that's actually supporting it. So really important. And also that there's an acceptance, a kind of culture of acceptance for failure, right? Not everything works when we try all of these things. And you know, when we look at public service kind of opportunities, one of the biggest challenges they have at looking at innovation is the fear of failure, right? And I think that's kind of natural. And one of the powerful things about this particular program is definitely from a financial perspective, we're helping de-risk these projects, right, by putting the financial side into it. So the risk of failure is eased, if you want to put it that way. So there's lots of areas. I go back to the challenge that I had earlier for you. If I was to put $500,000 on the table for you, and I asked you to do something transformational, something that will be of national interest, could you actually come up with a project that would be compelling and really interesting? So I'll give you another example of one of the discussions we're having with IDA here in Ireland. If we look at digital skills, you know, and the challenge is, how do we accelerate digital skills adoption in Ireland? And one of the ways that we're looking at doing that is, and I had the experience of trying to help a few people during the pandemic actually change career. I actually had a nurse and a pilot, right? And they were wondering what skills do they need, you know, to make a career change. And I tried to help them on their journey of that. And when I went looking for all the kind of courses that one might do, there's definitely, you can Google and you can go find all of these courses, but the questions that are hardest to answer with that challenge are, what am I capable of learning, right? And that applies to all of us. You know, everybody will have a different capability in what they can actually learn. What courses should I do? And probably more relevant, what courses lead to what job types and what opportunities in Ireland? And if you think in those data sets, they all exist. So we you know, there's always open job postings of what jobs are available. We have techniques that we can apply to this to assess anybody's capability of what they can learn. But what we really don't have is a mapping that if a farmer want to go into insurance, what digital skills might be needed. So we need to start looking at how we build those data sets and start applying AI technology, one, to assess what I'm capable of learning, two, to look at the job openings and what I'm interested, and three, when I kind of bridge those two environments, how would I apply AI to give me a recommended set of courses that I should actually follow for that particular job type? So that's an example of I guess an area that we're doing a lot of ideation around that could potentially become a CDA project working in conjunction with the IDA. So, you know, for any of you on this call, from health to transportation to industry, if you have ideas, if you have potential projects that you think would be transformational, please do get in touch with us, and we'll put it through a kind of business review to see how feasible it is. But we are looking for innovation. And for as long as I've been working in this, it's not that we need to come up with something that is so technically complex. Very often the most simple ideas are the most successful projects, but you're generally leveraging a number of technologies and combining them for a particular outcome. So with that, I think that may be the slides I actually have. Next slide, please. I think we're at the, yeah, I'll open up for questions if anybody would like to ask anything, but I hope I've given you some insight to the type of projects that we actually get involved in with this program.
Brian, thank you very much. Just a reminder to folks in the call, there's a Q&A panel on the right-hand side. You can feel free to drop in some questions and we'll bring them to Brian. Brian, I had a question for you for myself. So that vehicle to grid technology, I think, will revolutionize our network. How do you see the technology evolving into homes? Like, are smart meters set up to handle vehicle to grid? What's next needed in domestic environments to support vehicle to grid, do you think?
Yeah, so I think if we look at the power side of things, I think we'll have a lot more community power schemes being built, a lot of microgrids being built as we move forward, right? You know, the smart metering is very helpful because it can give you the insights into how you're using your power. You know, you should be putting your washing machine on at night or whatever. So the combination of that, what I'm waiting to see what develops is what happens with battery technology. Because right now, without batteries, right, you're still reliant on how we're currently producing electricity, which is very much, you know, gas powered in the main in Ireland, right? But we can't go 100% renewable without batteries. So,
exactly. Yeah.
And that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see how all that technology kind of plays out. And I certainly, you know, if you think of all the heat pumps we're putting into houses right now, you know, you still need electricity to run them, right? And if you have any kind of power cut, you know, we need a lot of battery technology. And we've done some interesting projects around that. Like there's buildings in Manchester being powered with some of the big Tesla batteries right outside, so you can use the cheap energy at night.
Yeah.
But I love this concept, and we see some companies like Crowley Carbon in Ireland promoting, certainly for the industrial users, you know, the use of batteries, because you can actually sell your excess storage back into the grid right now and make money out of it, right? And I think that concept is going to be very interesting to see how that concept takes off over the next 10 years, certainly down at the kind of citizen level in houses.
Yeah, it's decentralizing power, I think, to an extent as well. If you have panels on your roof and you're charging a 50 or 60 kilowatt hour battery, and you can feed it back to the house at a later date, and that's a sustainability element checked. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in. So again, a big thank you to Brian for his time again, coming back to AtlanTec. A reminder to folks, we have AtlanTec sessions coming up throughout the rest of the day. Visit atlantec.ie, and we will have AtlanTec sessions coming up for the rest of the week. So as always, it's a pleasure to be back. It's great to see AtlanTec continue to grow and evolve, and see new participants, new presenters speak over the last number of weeks or number of years as well. Again, thank you to Brian. Thank you to folks for joining, and I hope everyone has a good day, and we'll see you at the next session at 2 p.m. today.
Cheers all.